Coming up,
It was just all lies. But I held on to that hope that she was okay.
catching a monster,
He weaved a web of wicked deception.
the extraordinary police investigation
That's the moment.
that solved one of Australia's
Who does that to a little girl?
Chucked her away like rubbish.
most horrendous crimes. But she was in your care.
I'm not this monster, this unfit mother.
Hello again and welcome to our 60 Minutes podcast, Extra Minutes. My name is Dimity Clancey and joining me today is one of our brilliant producers here at 60, Anne Worthington, who we have spent a fair bit of time together lately. And
Certainly have.
you really get to know your colleagues on a different level when you work on a case, the one we have, which is the case of Charlise Mutten, which is a story about a little 9-year-old girl who was brutally murdered by a man she should have been able to trust. She was shot twice before her body was stuffed in a barrel and thrown down a riverbank. Now, it's a big story. There are so many moving parts to this story, and you've been working on it for 8 months, is when you first started to look into this case. Why did we do this story?
I think we chose to do the story because the murder of Charlise was a case that captured the heart of the nation. Who could forget that beautiful little face? And I think there was so much mystery and questions surrounding what happened in the days around her murder, the role of her mother in it. I personally felt like she had never really had her voice heard. She'd had to, her whole life had been put out there in the media, but she had never been able to tell her story. And that was mainly because there was a criminal trial and she was a key witness. And I think there was, a lot of circumstances around her behaviour and her decisions and her choices that she wanted to speak about.
When you first spoke to Callista Mutten, Charlise's mum, what did she say to you?
She said, "Anne, you really don't give up, do you?" And I said, well, I don't. I don't when I believe there's a story that needs to be told and a voice or someone who hasn't had their voice heard. And it's not just Callista in this as well. It was Charlise. It was, what did actually happen to this little girl? How did a holiday that was so anticipated go so horribly wrong? So I felt like this little girl needed to have a voice in the program for someone to talk about who this little girl was. The family, as a result of what has happened, is very fractured. And, the grandparents who Charlise was in the custody of have never spoken, and I doubt they ever will.
How are they?
From what I have learnt, I think they take every day step by step. Incredibly traumatised, and they must relive the decisions that they made and the choices they made. They must live with that every day.
Well, they raised Charlise since she was 4. They, even though Charlise had a relationship always with Callista and they would call each other every night and read a storybook at the end of the day, they had a good relationship. There is no doubt about that. And I think we learnt that in the case, that Callista always had a relationship with Charlise, but she was raised by her grandparents in Queensland. And the guilt they must feel about letting her go down for a month, a 9-year-old girl for a month, the guilt that they must carry. What were your first impressions of Callista when you first met her? I mean, I came to that meeting, I was there, but what did you think?
Well, I first spoke to her on the phone after trying to make contact with her for 8 months in various different ways. I finally got an email from Callista that dropped into my inbox, and then from that we had a meeting, a phone conversation and then a meeting. An incredibly vulnerable and fragile person, understandably, given her history and what has happened to her daughter. And someone who felt very misunderstood and vilified by the public, and someone who doesn't trust anybody. And she was very hesitant initially to do an interview because of that trust. And, she's told us, as she told you as well, that she has been abused in public, called a murderer, even though she didn't murder her child. But she was also someone who I saw had made an incredible effort to move on with her life and to try and
to clean up her life.
Her life.
We have to remember that when Charlise was murdered, Callista was in the grip of an ice addiction.
Yeah.
She was heavily addicted to ice. And she's struggled with addiction for many, many, many years since her death. And it's horrible that it took her daughter's death for her to wake up. But she has done a number of years of rehab. And I felt from sitting in front of her for the first time, because I think as parents we all have those questions, and I think that you do have to ask yourself, how could you be caring for that child and not think that this is not safe? I'm fighting with my fiance. I'm using drugs. It's not safe for my child to be here. I think that's was so frustrating and heartbreaking for Australia and the world to try and understand is what are you doing? When you've got this beautiful, innocent little girl in your care. I feel like Callista is trying, and I think it was really, for me, you could see that she is somebody that's had a really hard past, but she also owned it, and she does own it. And
Yes.
and I remember one thing she said to us was, it's a hell of a thing to look within when given what's happened. And I thought that is, she has had to dig deep inside herself. And, this is a woman who killed her passenger in the car, and then her daughter has been killed in the most brutal way. I just try and think, how would you be if that was you, if you were Callista? And I think that's something that I did. Is like, I don't know if I could even exist. Do you know, if that happened? But she gets up every day. She has been clean. She says for a number of years. I think she's doing the best with the past she's had and what she faces now and what she has to live with. Would be was my first assessment.
Absolutely. And I think, it's an ugly and uncomfortable story. And for her to talk about it, there was a great deal of shame involved for her as well. But she has been truthful. And when you look at Justin Stein, this is a man who couldn't tell the truth at any point. In the weeks leading up to Charlise's murder, he was manipulating and lying to everybody. Even then, the phone records show that. He's telling his mother that he's ending it with Callista. He's sending her messages saying that they're going to get married. So you have to give some credit to Callista for telling the truth.
And she trusted him. I mean, like she will say, this was a man that I was going to marry. And I asked her in the interview, did you have any concerns that he would ever be violent or mistreat her? And it was a straight no. No, she never had any reason to believe. And I truly believe that if she had any idea of the grave danger her daughter was going to be in, that she wouldn't have said, and Charlise wanted to go as well. It was such a toxic environment for that little girl to be in the first place. And I think that that's what the public have a hard time reconciling, is that you shouldn't have been doing that. You shouldn't have if he's as psycho as what we heard in those voicemails, why would you ever leave your child in that care? I think they're the sort of questions that people just can't get past, and that's the tragic part of this story. But when it comes to Justin Stein, who is the murderer in this case, he just unravelled himself, I think, from the start. So it was one of the best police briefs I think I've seen, and I've been covering crime in my career for a long time, and I think that the mountain of evidence for a circumstantial case, essentially, that they did, and they got the result that they did, I think is brilliant work on the detectives case. But they were some of the most experienced detectives working on this, and they had to work extremely quickly, because let's remember that Charlise was murdered 2 days before she was actually reported missing. So police had to then go back. What were some of those vital pieces of evidence that detectives had to find?
Well, that was one of the big criticisms that Callista faced, was that it took 2 days for her to report her daughter missing. Once she did, the case kind of moved very quickly, because within hours they had Justin Stein in. I think the challenge that they had was piecing together those 48 hours and this fantastical story that Justin Stein had weaved and convinced Callista with. And the way that they did that was through their ultimately their phone records. They had no CCTV footage that captured Charlise leaving with Justin Stein. They had all this CCTV in the days before, capturing going back and forward between the Mount Wilson property. But on that afternoon of the 11th of January, there was no CCTV. The ferry cameras had closed for the day, so they never had any footage to actually place Charlise with him getting back to the Mount Wilson property. But the text messages between the two, and, Callista's was clearly located down at the Hawkesbury River. Stein was up in Mount Wilson, and he was texting her saying that, yes, Charlise, we've arrived, we're home safe, I'm cooking chicken, Charlise is playing with balloons. They did find evidence later that she had, that there had been chicken cooked and that balloons had been played with. So they were able to, through predominantly the phone records, that gave Callista straight away an alibi. She wasn't there that night, and straight away he was.
And she
the
only
last
ever had
person
one
to
story.
see Charlise.
She never had a different story. She's had one story from
Yes.
the start, and that is the truth
Absolutely.
of what happened.
Yeah.
But
you couldn't make it up,
but
right?
with Justin
Stein
he would
make it
always
up.
he would drop a little bit of truth in his story,
Yes.
just to try and make himself believe that what he
Yes.
was saying was the truth. But
Yes.
he just went from story to story, but every time he did that, he just gave police more clues
Yes.
to just
Yeah.
make him...
And I think if the police, it was just, there was no stone left unturned. And I think with his web of lies, if they hadn't have pieced together that so forensically like they did, would the jury have been able to find beyond a reasonable doubt? I don't know. Because he is just such a compulsive liar. And, it sounds far-fetched for how could Callista have ever believed this story, but the auctioneer woman was someone that she had met. The auctioneer lady.
But that's what I mean, that little element of truth.
That's right.
There was always some truth. So it was
Yes.
for the detectives, it was about working out, well, what is the truth? What is it? And is it actually true? And did it actually happen?
Yeah.
And they did such a brilliant job. I remember when I first spoke to the homicide commander in New South Wales, Danny Doherty, and one of the other things he I think why they wanted to get involved was to show the impact that something like this sort of case has on the officers.
Yeah.
Let's think about it. Justin Hayton he found the barrel. That is a day at work that you never forget.
No. And I think you could see in his face
you absolutely
that he carries that with him every day as well.
Yeah, and it was a really good insight to just remember that, the police officers that work so hard to find answers and to hold people like Justin Stein to account, that they're human beings.
Yeah.
They're mums and dads. And, and in this case they were mums and mums and dads who had kids of around Charlise's age.
Yeah.
That's incredibly incredibly hard. And we took Justin Hayton back to that area on the banks of the Colo River, and that was hard for him. He was really emotional out there, and I think it was captured on the camera as well, that he talking about that moment of actually finding and looking over that embankment and seeing the barrel. Like, you could just see it in his eyes that he is still affected almost 3 years on.
Yeah.
From a moment like
well,
that.
I think you asked him, you can't unsee those moments. And
yeah. Well,
and
you
it's
can't,
true.
And they'll think about, Charlise Mutten for the rest of their time.
Yeah.
And how could you forget? It.
And I think the determination they felt to really get answers for the family and justice for Charlise, because the crime was just so horrific. I think that just spurred them on.
And you could hear it
determination.
in the lead investigator's voice, Brad Gardner, when we took him back at the back of the property there. We walked through, I don't know, what do you reckon, a kilometre of like thick bushland to get to that back of that property, because we had to, obviously we couldn't trespass, we had to stay on Crown land. But he really wanted to show us that area of where police believe that Charlise, you know, lost her life. And just hearing him describe that she was running away and then she gets shot in the back, and then he thinks that she fell to the floor and then is turning her little head. And that, I don't know, that gets me emotional, because I just think that, you know, the terror she would have felt when she was turning her head and that bullet to go into her face, her tiny little beautiful face. But you could hear that in Brad Gardner's voice when he was talking about that, you know, talking about the execution and you're just of a young child like that. And I just, they're just such, you know, such raw, honest police officers, and they just, from the start, they had that gut feel. They were experienced enough to have that gut feeling, but passionate enough to go, we're gonna get what we need to get here. And I think you can hear the frustration in their voice about not knowing the big question. Why? You know, why? Why would somebody do that? And, you know, I think there are enough clues, you know, and nobody knows, and nobody can, only Justin Stein knows, as they say, you know, but they're terrible dots to join. You know, you've got the first time Justin Stein and Charlise are alone together. You've got him looking on dating sites and pornography. You've got his medication found in her system. They're terrible dots to join. Yeah, they are. And nobody can do that conclusively, because, I mean, Justin Stein still denies that he even shot the little girl.
That's right. And they couldn't prove beyond reasonable doubt about how the medication got into her system. But, like you said, they're terrible dots to join. But just to know, I found it fascinating that, and I guess you do, and I guess like when you do a story, you know all the details about it, but that knowledge that Brad Gardner, the lead investigator, just has on every second of those days before and after Charlise was murdered. Yes. He just lives it like a movie in his mind, you know, and you could see that, and you could hear it, and the journey that those police officers have been on. But they did such a brilliant job. I've never seen a brief like it, and Absolutely. They got the result, life in prison without parole. And that's where Justin Stein, you know, I don't think anybody would argue that that's where Justin Stein belongs, and he got the punishment he deserves. Yeah, and I think, you know, that moment for Detective Gardner, because they could see him towing the boat around with an item on the back of the ute, but at that point, of course, they didn't realise that it was a barrel containing Charlise's body. They thought it could even be a big garden urn or something. They weren't sure, but they were clocking him with this object on the back of his ute. Yeah. And for that moment, he spoke about it, you know, a Sunday night after poring over hours of CCTV. In his kitchen. On a Sunday night. And then finally, you know, it's just that little tiny detail where he's like, the object in the back's gone. And I thought it was fascinating that he didn't wait to get that confirmation when he got the phone call from Detective Hayton to say, you know, I found the barrel. He just went straight to where surveillance was already on Justin Stein and just waited. Yeah. Waited until he could go in and get his man. Yes. You know, and that's just how committed they were to the investigation. The jail calls were really interesting in this as well, which was how Stein incriminated himself from behind bars, because it hadn't been released that Charlise had been shot twice. So by talking to his mother, he's revealing intimate details about what happened. Of course, he's by this time framing Callista for it. Callista was unaware of how her daughter had died and the two gunshots that had been inflicted on her. So these jail calls to his mother, which of course the detectives were, you know, I mean, the calls are recorded and they're listening in, but we're only incriminating him further by revealing this intimate knowledge that only the killer would know that she'd been shot twice. And then, of course, he asks his mum to go and to retrieve them from the bush. Retrieve the weapons. And it's so, for everybody, you know, watching, the mountain of
police exhibits. You have hours of CCTV, hours of police interview. To condense it into an hour, we had to be quite brutal, didn't we?
Yes.
And it's hard because there's so many details that we know from our research, we know about the case, and you want to try and get everything in, but you've got to fit it into 45 minutes of content.
I think it gave Callista an opportunity to talk about the relationship that she did have with her daughter. That was something that was really important to her. She owns her mistakes, but she did want people to know that she loved her daughter and that her daughter loved her as well. And they did have this relationship. And the grandparents, whilst they declined to be interviewed, did give us the permission to use and sent us those additional photos of Charlise, pictures of her that we haven't seen before.
Gorgeous little
And
face.
yeah, and I think that was, to help, to help give this little girl a voice and for people to remember who Charlise Mutten was.
And I've just always find it fascinating when somebody in Callista Mutten's position can find forgiveness. And you'd hope that you will, but she did say that it was for her own peace. She never will excuse what he's done. She calls him evil. She calls him a monster. But she says she forgives him so that he no longer has power over her.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really a poignant moment.
I think she still was in denial about the fact that he had done it for a very long time.
Well, she says she still didn't know, because the big why and exactly what played out is still like unknown to a point in this story. And I think until she got into that witness box at trial, I think there was still something inside Callista that thought maybe he didn't do it, or and then she said as soon as she found out that he was going to blame her, she knew that he had done it.
He had done it.
So
yeah, and I think the why eats Callista alive as well. It's not just the detectives, but for her to have those answers as well. But what possible reason could he give?
And I don't know how much difference that will make in her life. I always have people ask me after a story like that goes to air, how do you do that story? How do you work on that story? I've got young kids of my own. You've got young kids of your own. What do you say back to people when they ask you that?
I think it's just the determination for some answers around a case, and for someone like Charlise to not be forgotten. She made headlines back then, but to have the full circumstances told, but also to hold someone like Justin Stein to account, because he continues to lie. I think for people to really see him for what he is, and for all the evidence that was there, so there's not a shadow of doubt over who killed Charlise.
What about emotionally? How do you, as a journalist, when you spend so long on a story, investigating a story, talking, to this family, who I think you've spoken to every member of the family, on both sides, Justin and Callista's side, how do you cope with that emotionally?
It's just incredibly harrowing. I mean, I suppose, like the detectives that we spoke to, you're so focused on the job at hand that, that's where your focus is. I suppose it's afterwards that it kind of hits you. And I think, there was moments certainly during this investigation where it's heartbreaking to think that you can put a story out there, you can put it all together and do your job, but there's nothing that will bring that little girl back, ultimately.
And I always think as well, when I cover a story, we go home, because it hasn't happened to us, as the producer, as the reporter, as the cameraman, as the soundo, as, we go into people's lives and we sit in their lounge room and we speak to them. And for them, some of them, it's the biggest day. For Callista Mutten, this sharing her story is a huge thing in her life. And then we go home to our kids, and we go home to our happy homes. And then the story goes to air, and then we have to move on to the next story. But their story doesn't end, and I think it's, I always think back to that, and you know, when you go to like a disaster zone or something, you know, you go home to your warm bed, but those people, their story still goes. And I think you have to, I always look and go, well, what have I done for that family? How have I made it better for them, or how have I changed it for them, you know? And I think that as a journalist, that's what you aim to do. And I think in this case, giving Callista a chance to have her side, given the public scrutiny that she's felt and lived with for the past few years. And I really hope that her being able to speak out and have her say will help her, even if it's a little bit, to heal a little bit and to know that, you know, she did have a voice. Because I think a lot of the time with Justin Stein, she was controlled by him. She was manipulated, and she did what he said, and she didn't argue. And I think that was, you know, and then to be silenced again for the sake of her daughter, which she will say is for you know, she had to stay silent while the court was on. But I just hope that it gives her, you know, whether you like her, whether you agree with her, whether you know, her found out something new, or you still have the same opinion as you did before the story, you know, went to air. You know, I have had some feedback that people were incredibly frustrated to listen to that, and her decisions that she made, and that they're unforgivable. You know,
and I've had people at the same time who were very much of a certain mindset about Callista, who have found more compassion from understanding more of the nuances of and the extent of his manipulation and lies. Yeah. And she was blinded, unfortunately, by her love for this man. Yeah. As naive and as foolish as that was. And I think, she, you know, carries that burden with her every day. Yeah. And I think the fact she gets up, showers and faces the world is actually... Yeah. She forgives him, but she doesn't forgive herself. No. I think, you know, I think the story now is out there, and it's the full story. And I think that alone for her and her family, like, it's done now. It's if there's any doubts or anything, it's the full story is there for people to see. And it's an uncomfortable and harrowing story. But it's the full story. And well done on the story. You deal, just watching you operate, is, you know, you deal with such compassion, as we have to, especially on something so sensitively. But the way you have looked after this family during our investigation has been quite beautiful to watch. And I think that's the trust. You know, I think for any story, you have to have a rapport with someone, and you have to be they have to trust you. And at the same time, ask the questions that need to be asked. Absolutely. I mean, it's a fine dance, because you know, she made some dreadful decisions, and she knew that you would be asking those questions, and we had to. Yeah, we absolutely had to. They are what the nation wanted asked, and they were hard. You know, there were times in that interview where we did have to stop because it was becoming too much for her. Yes, but she didn't walk out. No, she came back and she answered some more. So where does it sit today in terms of the court? It's not over, is it? No, Justin Stein is appealing his sentence and his conviction. He's put in a notice to appeal. And so we'll just have to keep across that. And that gives him 12 months. 12 months. To actually lodge a formal appeal. So he's could be once again, buying himself time. But it will be very interesting to see on what grounds he would like to appeal, and exactly where he will go with that. So... The story does continue, at least for the next 12 months. And, there could be an appeal, which means that, you know, if he gets his appeal and he's granted that eventually, way down the track, it could mean a retrial. But we're a long way from that. But it's hard to see how, with the amount of evidence that they do have, it's hard to see how. But what have you got to lose when you're in life? You know, when you're in prison for life without parole, you'd give it a shot, wouldn't you? Well, he's obviously still believing his own lies. He always will. And thank you so much for joining us. And remember, you can watch the full story on the 60 Minutes YouTube channel. My name is Dimity Clancey. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.